Tom Bombadil had not left the Old Forest in approximately 6,000 years. This was not an estimate that could be verified with any precision because Tom did not keep records, and the forest did not keep time in the way that elves or men or even dwarves understood the keeping of it. But it was approximately true, and Tom did not think about it often, because thinking about leaving the forest was not something that occurred naturally to a being who had been in the forest since before the forest had a name. He had watched the first acorn fall. He had watched the first elf walk beneath the first beech tree, with the first question forming on lips that had not yet learned the shape of questions. He had watched the sun and the moon take their places, and he had found them satisfactory enough. The river Withywindle knew his name, and the name was the only name that mattered, because the river had been there when names began and would be there when names ended. He did not leave. The world outside the forest was a world of lords and borders and the drawing of lines upon maps, and Tom had never understood the impulse to draw lines upon things that belonged to no one. The forest was his, and he was the forest's, and that arrangement had held for so long that it had ceased to be an arrangement and become simply the nature of things. He was not lonely because loneliness required the concept of absence, and Tom did not experience absence as other beings experienced it. Goldberry was there, and the bees were there, and the badgers and the foxes, and the trees who had learned over the centuries to speak in a language that only Tom understood, and Tom was content. The first sign that something had changed arrived on a Tuesday in late September in the year the hobbits came. Tom knew the hobbits had entered the forest before they knew they had entered it. He felt them, the way a spider feels a thread tremble 4 webs away. 4 small beings with heavy feet and heavier hearts moving through the trees with the particular anxiety of creatures who did not belong here and knew it. He had watched them for most of a morning without revealing that he was watching. The trees had noticed them too. Old Man Willow most of all. Old Man Willow had been angry for 3,000 years, and the anger had settled into his roots the way damp settled into stone, and it was not going anywhere now. The tree had caught 2 of the hobbits in its roots and was singing them deeper into the wood, and Tom had considered for approximately 3 seconds whether to intervene. He intervened. He sang Old Man Willow back to sleep with a song that the tree had heard before, in the days when the forest was young and the darkness had not yet learned to settle into the bark. The tree slept. The hobbits were freed, and Tom took them to his house. Goldberry was waiting. She was always waiting in the sense that she was always present, and presence was not the same thing as waiting. But the hobbits did not understand this, and Tom did not explain it, because explanations were not what the hobbits needed. The hobbits needed food and water and a fire, and the particular quiet of a house that had stood for longer than any of them had been alive. They ate. They talked. Tom did not ask many questions because questions were not his way, but he listened to the answers that the hobbits gave without being asked, and what he heard was a name he had not expected to hear again. The Ring. They did not say it at first. They talked around it, the way hobbits talked around things that frightened them, with small words and sideways glances, and the careful omission of details that they hoped no one would notice. But Tom noticed. Tom noticed everything. And when the hobbit called Frodo finally produced the thing from his pocket and set it on the table between them, Tom looked at it for a long moment with an expression that was not surprise, and not recognition, and not fear. It was something older than all 3. He picked it up. He looked through it. He put it on his finger and did not vanish. The hobbit stared. Frodo's hand had gone to his chest, where the ring had been hanging on its chain, and his face was the face of someone who had just watched the impossible happen and was still processing the shape of it. Tom laughed. The laugh was not mocking. It was the laugh of someone who had seen a great many things that other people called important, and had found most of them considerably less important than they believed themselves to be. He handed the ring back to Frodo with the casualness of someone returning a borrowed cup, and the hobbit took it with hands that were not steady. And then Tom sang them to sleep, and the evening passed, and in the morning they left. Tom stood at the edge of the forest and watched them go, the four small figures disappearing eastward toward the Barrow Downs and the road and everything that waited beyond. He did not follow them. He had not been asked to follow them. He went back to the forest, and the forest closed around him, the way water closes around a stone, and the days passed. But something had shifted. He noticed it 3 days later, when he was walking along the Withywindle, and the river spoke his name differently than it usually did. Not in greeting, in question. The question was not formed in words, because the river did not use words in the way that Tom used words, but the meaning was clear enough. Something was moving in the world beyond the trees, something old and patient and hungry. And the river wanted to know what Tom intended to do about it. Tom sat on the bank for most of the afternoon and thought about the ring. He had held it in his hand, and he had understood it completely, in the way that he understood most things without needing to examine them. The ring was a fragment of a consciousness that had been poured into gold 17 ages ago by a being who had mistaken power for permanence and cruelty for wisdom. The fragment was not inert, it was waiting. It had been waiting for nearly 5,000 years, and it was perfectly content to wait another 5,000 if that was what was required. The fragment had looked at Tom when Tom held it, and Tom had looked back, and the fragment had understood something in that moment that no other being in Middle-earth had ever understood. Tom Bombadil was older than the ring. He was older than its maker. He was older than the mountain where it was forged, and the fire that forged it, and the darkness that gave the fire its heat. The ring had no hold on him, because there was nothing in Tom that the ring could offer. He did not want power. He did not want dominion. He did not want anything that the ring was capable of giving. And the ring had seen this, and had understood for the first time in its long existence that it was facing something it could not corrupt, and could not tempt, and could not break. The ring was afraid of Tom Bombadil. Tom had felt it. He had felt the cold pulse of it in the gold when he held it. The fragment had recoiled the way a snake recoils from a fire, not because the fire was stronger, because the fire was something the snake could not bite. He did not tell the hobbits this. They had enough to carry. They did not need to know that the most powerful object in Middle-earth was afraid of a man who lived in a house by a river and sang to badgers. They would not have understood it, and Tom was not certain that he fully understood it himself. He understood only that something had changed, and that the river had noticed, and that the question the river was asking was not going to go away simply because Tom declined to answer it. The second sign came a week later, on a Thursday morning, while Tom was gathering water from the spring. Goldberry came out of the house and stood in the doorway with her hands folded in front of her, and the expression she wore when something was present that had not been present before. She did not speak. She did not need to speak. Tom looked at her, and then looked past her toward the eastern edge of the forest, and saw what she had seen. A darkness was gathering over the Barrow Downs. Not a cloud, not weather. Something else. Something that moved against the wind rather than with it. Something that had the particular quality of attention that Tom associated with very old things that had been sleeping for a long time and had recently been woken. The darkness was not aimed at the forest. It was moving south and east toward the lands of men and elves and the long valleys where the armies of the enemy were beginning to gather. But it was close enough to feel, and the feeling was not comfortable. Tom set down the water and dried his hands on his coat. The coat was blue and old, and had been blue and old for longer than most kingdoms had existed, and Tom had worn it through every season the forest had known, and would wear it through every season the forest would know, and the coat was not concerned about the darkness over the Barrow Downs. But Tom was concerned. He had been concerned since the hobbits left. The concern was not large, but it was persistent, and persistence was not something that Tom experienced often. Most things passed. This one did not. He went inside. He sat at the table. Goldberry brought him bread and honey and did not ask what he was thinking, because she already knew. She had known since the day the hobbits arrived. She had watched Tom hold the ring, and she had watched the ring fail to touch him, and she had understood in that moment that the world had entered a new chapter, and that the chapter required something from her husband that the forest had never required. Tom ate the bread. He ate the honey. The afternoon light came through the window and lay across the table in the long, golden lines of September. He did not decide that day. He did not decide the next day. The decision arrived on its own, approximately 2 weeks later, when an elf passed through the western edge of the forest on a journey that Tom noticed but did not interrupt. The elf was one of the wandering kind who still walked the old roads of Eriador. He was not young. Elves were never young, and this one was older than most. And he carried with him a burden of knowledge that Tom could read from 50 paces without needing to draw closer. The elf knew about the ring. He knew about the council that had been called in Rivendell. He knew that the enemy was moving, and that the free peoples were gathering, and that a fellowship had been formed to carry the ring into the heart of the dark land itself. And he knew something else, something that he had not told anyone because he was not certain it was true, and an elf of his years did not speak uncertain truths in times of war. He knew that the Nine were abroad. The Nazgul had been scattered at the ford of Bruinen, but they were not destroyed. They were regrouping, they were waiting, and they were looking for the ring with a desperation that was itself a kind of weapon. Tom sat by the Withywindle that evening and thought about the Nine. He had encountered their kind before, not these specific Nine. The Nine had been mortal men once, and their transformation was a thing of the Third Age, and Tom had been here long before the Third Age began. But he had encountered the darkness that powered them. He had felt it at the dawn of the world, when it was not yet darkness, and was simply a discord in the music that had not yet learned what shape it was going to take. He knew its texture, he knew its temperature, he knew what it wanted and what it feared. The Nine would come to the edges of the forest eventually. They would not enter. The forest did not permit their kind, and the trees remembered the darkness from the days when it had first tried to claim the woodlands, and the trees had not forgotten. But the Nine would wait. They would circle. They would watch. And they would follow anyone who left the protection of the trees and carried with them the scent of the ring. The hobbits had passed through the forest 5 weeks ago. The scent was faint now, but it was not gone. It would never be entirely gone from the places where the ring had been held, and the old forest was one of those places now. The Nine would find it, and they would trace it, and they would understand that something in this forest was different from everything else they had encountered in their long hunting. Something that did not fear them, something that they might need to fear instead. Tom did not fear the Nine. He had never feared anything that walked on 2 legs or 4, or none at all. Fear was not a language he had learned to speak, but he understood threat in the way that the river understood rain. Threat was simply something that was coming, and the only question was what to do about it. He went back to the house. He sat with Goldberry while the fire burned low and the forest settled into its night rhythms around them. He told her what he was thinking. He told her about the fragment he had held in his hand and the fear he had felt in the gold and the darkness gathering over the downs and the elf passing through with the news of the Nine. He told her that he was considering something he had not considered in 6,000 years. He was considering leaving. Goldberry listened the way the earth listens to rain. Without interruption, without judgment, with the patience of someone who had been married to Tom Bombadil for longer than the sun had been measured in hours. She did not tell him to stay. She did not tell him to go. She said only that the river would miss him, and that she would keep the water warm, and that the forest would remember the shape of his footsteps until he returned. And Tom understood that this was her way of saying that she loved him, and that she trusted him, and that whatever decision he made, she would still be here when he came back. He left on a Friday morning in the first week of October. He did not bring provisions. He did not bring a weapon. He brought his coat and his hat and his boots and a small bundle of herbs that Goldberry pressed into his hands at the door, and nothing else. He did not say goodbye to the badgers or the foxes or the trees. He would be back. The goodbye was not a goodbye. It was a pause in a conversation that had been going on for 6 millennia and would continue for 6 more. He walked east. He walked through the Barrow Downs where the darkness was still gathering, and the Barrow Wights stirred in their cold chambers and felt him pass, and did nothing. The Wights were old, but Tom was older, and the Wights knew it. He walked through the empty lands east of Bree, where the rangers kept their watch. He passed a ranger on the second day, a tall man in a grey cloak who stood very still and watched Tom cross the heath without approaching. The ranger's hand was on his sword, but he did not draw it. He had the look of someone who had seen many strange things in the wild, and had learned to distinguish between the things that were dangerous and the things that were merely inexplicable. Tom was not dangerous. Tom was the most inexplicable thing the ranger had ever seen, and the ranger let him pass. On the 4th day, Tom reached the Weather Hills, where the ancient watchtower of Amon Sul stood broken against the sky. The tower had been ruined for more than 1,000 years, but the stones remembered what they had been, and Tom could feel the memory in them, the way he could feel the memory in old trees. He climbed to the summit and stood among the broken stones and looked east. The shadow was clearer from here, not the shadow of cloud or weather, but the shadow of will. Sauron's attention was fixed on the lands to the south, where the armies were gathering, but a portion of that attention was still searching, the portion that belonged to the Nine. The portion that was following a trail of faint light through the wilderness, the trail of the ring. Tom sat on a fallen stone and waited. He did not know precisely what he was waiting for. He knew only that something was moving toward him from the east, and that it was moving with purpose, and that the purpose was not friendly. The Nazgul had not crossed the Grey Flood since their defeat at the ford, but they were crossing now. 4 of them, moving fast under the cover of the darkness that was gathering in the east. They had picked up the trail that the hobbits had left weeks ago, and they were following it westward toward the old forest. They did not know that the trail led to a house by a river, where a woman with golden hair was waiting for her husband to return. They knew only that the trail existed, and that the ring had been here, and that whatever had held the ring had left something of itself behind in the places where it had rested. Tom felt them before he saw them. They were still miles away, but the feeling was unmistakable. Cold and hollow and hungry. The feeling of beings who had been alive for so long that they had forgotten what alive meant. They rode black horses that were not horses in any ordinary sense. The horses had been bred in the darkness of Mordor, and fed on things that were not grass, and their eyes were the colour of old blood. They moved without sound. They moved without hesitation. They moved toward Tom with the absolute certainty of things that had found what they were looking for. The lead rider crested the western slope of Weathertop at dusk. He was tall and thin, and the hood of his black cloak was drawn forward so that the face beneath was visible only as a suggestion of presence. He did not dismount. He sat on his black horse and looked at the small figure in the blue coat, sitting on the fallen stone, and he did not speak for a long time. The other 3 riders came up behind him and arranged themselves in a semicircle. They had the quality of people who had not expected to find what they had found. They had been following the scent of a hobbit and the weight of a ring, and they had arrived instead at a man who was not a man, and a presence that was not hobbit-sized, and a power that did not feel like anything they had encountered in 3,000 years of hunting. Tom looked at them. He had not moved from the stone. He had his hands in the pockets of his blue coat, and his hat was pushed back on his head, and his face was the face of someone who had been waiting for something, and had finally seen it arrive. The lead rider spoke. His voice was not a voice in the ordinary sense. It was the sound of cold stone grinding against cold stone, in a place where the sun had never reached. The question he asked was not a question that Tom had expected. He asked what manner of being stood before him. He asked it in the black speech, which was the only language the Nazgul had, and the language was old and cruel, and it hurt the air as it passed. The rider asked it because he could not see into Tom. He had tried. He had reached forward with the will that Sauron had given him, and had found nothing to grasp. The small figure on the stone was not warded. He was not protected in any conventional sense. He was simply there, in a way that the will could not touch, and the rider had never encountered anything like it. Tom said nothing. He looked at the rider with the same calm attention that he brought to badgers and foxes and hobbits who had gotten themselves stuck in tree roots. His silence was not defiance, and it was not fear. It was the silence of someone who was waiting for the rider to understand what he was looking at. The rider understood slowly. He had been alive for 4,000 years, and in that time he had learned to recognize power even when it did not display itself in the usual ways. The power in front of him was not the power of armies or artifacts or dark lords. It was older than all of those things. It was the power of something that had been present at the beginning and had not been altered by anything that had happened since. The rider's hand went to the hilt of his sword. It was an instinct. The sword was a Morgul blade, forged in the darkness of Minas Morgul, and it had never failed to wound anything it struck. But the rider did not draw it. Some part of him that was still capable of calculation understood that the blade would not be enough. The rider spoke again. He asked a different question this time. He asked whether Tom had seen the ring. He asked it in Westron now because the black speech had not worked, and something in the rider understood that the small figure on the stone was not going to be intimidated by language. Tom considered the question for a moment. He had seen the ring. He had held the ring. He had watched the ring fail to touch him, and the rider was asking whether he knew where the ring was. Tom said yes. He said it simply and completely, and without elaboration. The word fell into the cold air between them, and the horses shifted, and the other three riders exchanged glances that were not visible beneath their hoods, but were palpable nonetheless. The lead rider leaned forward slightly. The darkness around him deepened the way water deepens when something heavy sinks into it. He asked where. Tom told him. He did not lie. He did not need to lie. He said that the ring was somewhere between the misty mountains and the sea, and that it was moving south and east, and that it was being carried by creatures the rider would not expect. He said that the ring did not want to be found by the Nine. He said that the ring was afraid. Not of the Nine. The ring was not afraid of its master's servants. The ring was afraid of what was carrying it. The ring was afraid of the small hands that held it, and the determined hearts that drove it, and the unexpected courage of beings who had no business being courageous. The rider was very still. The information was more than he had expected to receive. The information was also almost entirely useless. It told him that the ring was moving, and that it was being carried by hobbits which he had already known, and it told him nothing about where to find it. Tom had given him the truth, and the truth was a closed door. The rider drew his sword. It was a slow motion. The motion of someone who had drawn a sword many times and had learned that the drawing itself was a form of communication. The blade came out black and cold, and the light that was left in the evening sky seemed to pull away from it. The rider pointed it at Tom. He said that Tom would tell him where the ring was, or Tom would not leave this hill. He said it in the voice of someone who had made this threat 10,000 times and had never once been required to carry it out because the threat itself was sufficient. The threat was not sufficient here. Tom looked at the sword with the same expression he had worn when the hobbit had placed the ring on his table. The expression of someone examining a thing that had no power over him and finding it mildly interesting. Tom stood up. It was the first time he had moved in half an hour. He stood and brushed the dust from his blue coat and adjusted his hat and looked at the four riders arrayed before him. He was not large. He was considerably smaller than any of them. His boots were old, and his coat was patched at the elbows, and his face was the face of a man who had spent 6,000 years living in a forest and had no interest in anything that happened beyond its borders. And the riders drew back. They did not intend to. They did not decide to. Their horses stepped backward without being commanded. The darkness around them thinned slightly. The cold that radiated from them pulled in toward their centers like a cloak being gathered. Tom spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not sing. He simply spoke in the same tone he used when he told the trees to release the hobbits or the river to carry the leaves downstream. He told the riders that they were not welcome here. He told them that the lands west of the Grey Flood were not theirs to hunt, and that the trail they were following ended here. He told them that the ring was not going to be found by the likes of them. He told them that the darkness they served had been a discord in the music before the music had learned its own shape, and that the discord would pass, and the music would continue, and they would not be part of the continuation. He told them to leave. And they left. They did not argue. They did not threaten. They turned their black horses and rode east, and the darkness rode with them, and within 5 minutes the summit of Weathertop was empty and quiet, and Tom was alone with the broken stones and the memory of what had just happened. He stood there for a while. The stars came out. The wind came up from the south, carrying the smell of distant rain. Tom thought about the 9 and what they would tell their master when they returned to Mordor. They would tell him that the ring was being carried south by hobbits. They would tell him that they had been turned back at the Weather Hills. They would not tell him what had turned them back. They did not have the language to describe Tom Bombadil, and Sauron did not have the imagination to understand him even if they did. Tom climbed down from Weathertop as the moon rose. He walked west toward the old forest. He walked without hurry because hurry was not in his nature, and because the thing he had come here to do was done. He had not joined the Fellowship. He had not marched to Mordor. He had not done anything that the wise would recognize as useful. But the 9 had been hunting the trail of the ring westward toward the Shire, and the old forest and Goldberry's house by the river, and now they were not. They had been turned back by something they could not name, and could not fight, and would not easily explain to their master. The hunt would continue, but it would continue without the certainty it had possessed 4 days ago. And that was not nothing. Tom reached the forest on the 4th day, and crossed the Withywindle at the same ford where he had rescued the hobbits 7 weeks earlier. The water was cold and clear, and it spoke his name in the tone that meant, "Welcome home." The trees rustled on both banks. The badgers came out of their holes and watched him pass. The foxes sat at the edges of the clearings with their heads tilted. Goldberry was standing in the doorway when he reached the house. She had known he was coming. She always knew. She did not ask what had happened. She took the bundle of herbs from his pocket, which was empty because he had given the herbs to a sick fox near Bree, and led him inside and gave him bread and honey and water. Tom sat at the table and ate, and the fire was warm, and the house was the same house it had always been, and the peace of the forest settled around him like a coat that had been waiting for him to return. He told her about the Nazgul eventually. He told her that they would not come to the forest. He told her that the trail they had been following was cold now, and that the hunt had turned south toward the lands where the armies were gathering. He told her that he did not know whether the hobbits would succeed. He had never claimed to know the future. He knew only that the fragment he had held in his hand was more afraid than it had been in 5,000 years, and that the fear was justified. The war would continue. The ring would go south. The hobbits would walk into darkness, and some of them would not return. But the old forest was safe. The river was safe. The house by the Withywindle was safe. And Tom had done something that no one in Rivendell or Gondor or Mordor would ever know about. He had stood on a hill in the cold October wind and looked into the hollow faces of the 9 and told them to leave. And they had left. Because the oldest things in Middle-earth recognized one another, and the Nazgul had recognized in Tom Bombadil something that was older than their fear and stronger than their darkness, and completely, utterly, and permanently beyond their reach. Tom finished his bread. He finished his honey. He went outside and stood in the garden with Goldberry and watched the stars come up over the Withywindle. The war was far away now. The forest was quiet. The badgers were asleep. The foxes were dreaming. And the oldest being in Middle-earth put his arm around his wife and did not think about the ring or the darkness or the years that were coming. He thought about tomorrow. The water would be clear. The sun would come up. He would walk the forest and sing to the trees, and the world would continue, because that was what the world did.